Chapter 4. Ash and Echoes. Tim didn't drive home right away. He stopped at a rest area off the highway, killed the engine, and sat. The rain had followed him, soft and steady, trailing across the windshield like the story he still hadn't written. Two encounters, two entities that shouldn't exist, and he had survived. He should have been unraveling, running, but instead all he could feel was stillness, like something inside him had clicked into place, like a compass that had been spinning for years finally found north. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and breathed. If this was the world now, ghosts, spirits, monsters, then he didn't want to look away from it. Not anymore. Not anymore. He pulled out his notebook and flipped past pages of scribbled interviews, GPS coordinates, and scrawled sigils. This wasn't an accident, it never had been, and whatever was out there, whatever else was real, he was going to find it. Not just to understand it, to stop it. 2 days later, Tim sat in a diner booth, half focused on his coffee and flipping through local papers he'd collected from a nearby gas station rack. One headline caught his attention. Local motel owner claims repeated sightings of visitor only seen by tenant. It was buried in the community column of a weekly newsletter, but the address was nearby, just outside of Morganville. Tim flagged down the waitress. "Hey," he said, tapping the paper. "This place, the Red Pines Motel, know anything about it?" She leaned over. "That place? It's quiet. Mostly truckers. There was an older woman staying there, but she moved out a few days ago, said someone was watching her. Staff said no one was booked in the room but her. Did she describe the person?" The waitress frowned. "Just said he was pale, didn't speak. Always by the window." Tim wrote the details down. Not an overheard rumor. Not coincidence. A thread. He paid, left a tip, and walked out into the rain. The next case had found him. Red Pines Motel looked like a leftover memory. White siding, green trim, 6 rooms in a single row. It sat alone on a long stretch of road outside Morganville, backed by trees that leaned a little too close. Tim arrived late afternoon. The office smelled like stale coffee and pine-scented cleaner. A man behind the desk, maybe 60, maybe older, looked up from a crossword. "Need a room?" he asked, voice rough but polite. Tim nodded. "One night, maybe 2. He signed the ledger with his usual alias and slid his card across the counter. "Quiet here?" Tim asked. The man shrugged. "Most nights, though we had a lady check out early last week, said her room wasn't empty." What did she mean? She claimed she saw someone standing by the window every night. Thin fella, pale, didn't speak, wouldn't move, just stood there and stared. Security footage? Didn't show anything. The man slid a key across the counter. "Room 3. That was hers." Tim took the key. "Thanks." "If you see him," the man said, cracking a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "tell him he still owes me for 3 nights. Room 3 smelled like dust, window cleaner, and something faintly metallic. The curtains were drawn. The air was still. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. Tim set his bag on the bed and did a slow circuit. Old radiator, dresser with chipped handles. Small table with 1 chair, a mirror bolted to the wall opposite the bed, a TV with a busted remote. Nothing unusual. He sat, waited, nothing happened. He turned on the recorder. Room 3, Red Pines Motel. First impressions, residual atmosphere, but no direct phenomena. Waiting for nightfall. He unpacked slowly, took photos, marked the corners of the room with chalk, just in case. Outside, the light began to fade. Inside, the air grew heavier, and when he looked up from his notebook, the mirror was fogged. He hadn't used the sink. The radiator was cold. But in the fog, a handprint. It wasn't large, average size, but wrong somehow, too long in the fingers, too narrow at the wrist. Tim stepped closer. The print didn't fade with his breath. It wasn't made of condensation. It was left behind. He raised the recorder again. A single handprint has appeared on the mirror. No confirmed source. Shape is humanoid, but elongated. Tim reached for the mirror. His fingers hovered just above the glass. Then he touched it. Dry. He grabbed a camera from his bag, snapped 3 quick photos, and marked the mirror's frame with chalk. The handprint stayed. That night, Tim kept the lights low and the door locked. He monitored the mirror, the window, the floor. At 3:12 a.m., he woke up without knowing why. The room was silent, still. Then, a soft knock. Not at the door. From inside the bathroom. 3 knocks. Deliberate. Tim didn't move for a full minute. Then he stood, crossed the room, and opened the door. Nothing. But the mirror had fogged again. This time, the handprint was joined by another. Smaller. and beneath them both, in the fog, written by an unseen finger, "Let me in." Tim stared at the words for a long time. He didn't wipe them away. Instead, he stepped back, sat down at the table, and started cross-referencing. He searched regional ghost sightings, folklore databases, message boards, any mention of apparitions connected to mirrors. Nothing matched exactly. But one thread from 2006 caught his eye. They come through glass, especially if you name them, especially if you open the door. Below that, they need to be invited, but the mirror counts as a door. He didn't like that. Tim shut the laptop, rechecked the chalk lines. Then he lit a tea light and placed it in front of the mirror. "You're not welcome," he said. The flame flickered. The fog didn't clear. But the words were gone. The handprints remained. The next morning, Tim drove into Morganville's historical district, a cluster of red brick buildings and faded storefronts with plaques older than the parking meters. The local library sat wedged between a florist and a diner, mostly empty except for a teenage clerk who didn't look up from her phone. He dove into regional archives, obituaries, police reports, urban legends. One recurring story stopped him cold: the Mirror Watcher, first reported in 1919, then again in 1938, 1975, 1992, always in motels, inns, or rest homes, always seen in reflections. Pale figure, doesn't speak, doesn't move, just watches. Victims reported strange dreams, night sweats. Some claimed they saw things that weren't theirs, memories they'd never lived. Most recovered. A few disappeared. Local folklore called it a Glimmer Man. Not a ghost. Not quite a demon, something in between. Drawn to places where people felt unseen. Tim scribbled notes, cross-referenced other reports. Lenora had once mentioned reflective gateways, thin places that acted like a window and a threshold. Glimmer men couldn't step through unless invited. But they could anchor themselves to glass, spread slowly, like mold. Tim circled one note and read, "It never blinks. If it does, run." He frowned at the line. It felt dramatic, maybe even superstition layered onto rumor. But folklore always had its tells. A detail like that didn't stick around for over a century unless someone believed it mattered. So he wrote it down, just in case. Then he dug deeper. One article from 1975 mentioned a drifter who invited the figure in. Locals found the man days later, comatose but breathing. He never woke up. The motel owner swore the mirror in his room shattered from the inside. In 1992, a nurse in a long-term care facility spoke to someone she claimed was her dead husband for 6 nights. On the 7th, she vanished. Her room was locked from the inside. Both events involved mirrors. Both followed a pattern: the invitation, the staring, then the break. Tim underlined one phrase in the report: the subject felt watched until they no longer minded. He leaned back in his chair. The Glimmer Man wasn't just watching, it was waiting to be wanted. That night, Tim returned to room 3 just before sundown. He returned with salt, a compact infrared camera, and a folding hand mirror picked up from a thrift store down the road. He set the mirror facing the large one. Then he waited. Hours passed. No fog, no knock, no words. Just his own reflection, until he looked into the hand mirror. The figure was there, standing just behind him in the large mirror. Pale, still, not in the room, only in the reflection. Tim didn't move, just whispered into the recorder, "Visual confirmation, entity visible only through indirect reflection." The figure blinked, once. Tim dropped the hand mirror. It cracked. The figure didn't vanish. It smiled. Tim didn't wait. He stood slowly, drew a line of salt across the carpet between himself and the mirror. His heart was hammering, but his hands moved with purpose. He had seen this pattern before. Invitation, invitation, then the break. He wasn't going to let it reach step 3. From his bag, he pulled a vial of yew ash and a cheap motel matchbook. He struck a match, lit a candle, and placed both at the base of the mirror. The flame reflected back until it didn't. The figure blocked it. Just a shadow now, shifting slightly, as if pacing. Tim stepped forward just enough to hear his own breath bounce back off the glass. "You don't belong here," he said. The figure tilted its head. "You're not invited," Tim added, "and I know your name." He whispered the phrase he'd found buried in the 1938 article, a string of syllables, part Latin, part something older. The mirror cracked again, not a shatter, just a growing fracture from the center outward. The figure lunged. Tim threw the ash. The glass screamed, not audibly, more like the idea of a scream, the kind that lives under the skin, Light flashed from the reflection, and the image twisted, once violently, and vanished. The mirror went dark, and the room was still. The candle burned steady. He didn't breathe until the mirror cooled. The Glimmer Man was gone, but the glass would never be clean again. Tim checked out before sunrise. The man at the front desk didn't ask about the mirror. Didn't ask about the salt. He just nodded, handed Tim a receipt, and said, "Take care of yourself." Back in his car, Tim sat for a long moment. The motel in the rearview looked smaller than it had felt. He pulled out his notebook. Beneath a scrawled header, Glimmer Man, he added one final line. "It doesn't want to kill you. It wants to be let in." He closed the book. 3 cases, 3 different creatures, different legends, but each fed on something human: grief, guilt, memory, loneliness. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. Something tied it all together. He could feel it tightening, like threads pulled toward a center he couldn't see yet. The next lead waited in a manila folder tucked behind the passenger seat. A missing persons bulletin from a lakeside town 3 hours north. The last line of the report read, "Witness claimed to hear voices coming from the water." Tim started the engine and kept driving.